You're listening to Skeptoid. I'm Brian Dunning from Skeptoid.com. Loys Ape. Today we're going to point the skeptical eye at one of the many cryptids known from some scant evidence. Our subject is Loys Ape, also called Ameranthropoides loysi. It is said to be an unknown species of primate, walking bipedally through the jungles of South America, like a hominid, having no tail, like an ape, but bearing the physical appearance of a monkey. It stands 1.5 meters tall, 4.5 feet, and is known primarily from a single photograph, taken by an oil expedition in Venezuela sometime around 1920. The world had known that Venezuela held vast oil reserves since the first Spanish conquerors arrived in the 16th century, but it wasn't until the early 1900s that the first modern oil wells were drilled. Following World War I, oil prospecting exploded in Venezuela, such that by 1929 it was the world's largest oil exporting nation. In 1917, Swiss geologist François Delois, spelled Deloys, was only one of countless Europeans brought in by the oil companies to prospect. Delois spent the better part of 4 years in Venezuela, traveling about and prospecting. It was during this period that something happened that would make Delois famous forever. If you do an image search for Loys Ape or Ameranthropoides loysi, you'll find plenty of results. The creature is known by a single old black and white photograph showing a dead specimen, propped up with a stick under its chin, posed in a sitting position on a wooden crate. The face is ugly, quite eerily so, in fact. Physically, the animal looks a lot like a spider monkey, but is said to have been substantially larger than any known spider monkey. According to the story, Delois and his prospecting party were in the jungle. Delois himself told the tale in a 1929 issue of the Illustrated London News, which was reprinted in the Washington Post and titled, "Found at Last, the First American." The jungle swished open, and a huge, dark, hairy body appeared out of the undergrowth, standing up clumsily, shaking with rage, grunting and roaring and panting as he came onto us at the edge of the clearing. The sight was terrifying. The beast jumped about in a frenzy, shrieking loudly and beating frantically his hairy chest with his own fists. Then he wrenched off at one snap a limb of a tree and, wielding it as a man would a bludgeon, murderously made for me. I had to shoot. My Winchester got the best of the situation. Riddled with bullets, the great body soon fell on the ground almost at my feet and quivered for a while. He gathered his arms over his head as if to hide his face and, without a further groan, expired. Delois examined the creature and discovered that it had no tail, which is characteristic of great apes and not of monkeys. He found that it had 32 teeth, which also differs from New World monkeys who have 36. From there, most versions of the story state that Delois and the survivors of his party tried to preserve the head and hide of the beast, but that both were lost or abandoned during the group's subsequent misadventures and clashes with natives. Knowledge of Loys Ape's story might never have reached the public consciousness were it not for the involvement of the French anthropologist Georges Montandon. Montandon's interest was race. In fact, he later developed a racial taxonomy to classify and categorize many different races of humans. I was not able to find how and when Delois and Montandon first met, but 1929 is when he saw Delois' photograph and heard his tale. As Delois told the story to the public in the newspapers, Montandon told the story to the scientific community. He published an article in the Journal de la Société des Americanistes and presented a talk to the French Academy of Sciences. Montandon declared that Loys Ape was a new species and gave it the name Ameranthropoides loysi. Ultimately, Montandon failed to convince scientists, and Ameranthropoides loysi never made it into any taxonomy other than his own. But the more visible campaign, the public campaign waged by Delois himself, was quite successful. Loys Ape has been a pinnacle of cryptozoology ever since, and is featured in virtually every book on the subject. Coming into this topic, the question I wanted to answer was how we should go about determining the truth of Loys Ape. As with most questions like this, it's quite possible that we can never know the answer for a certainty, but we can at least get a pretty good idea. The three most likely possibilities are that it truly is a new species, that it was deliberately hoaxed somewhere along the line, or the third and most common possibility, that it was an honest misidentification combined with trumped-up reporting. This is the null hypothesis, that nothing extraordinary is proved to have happened, either a deliberate hoax or an actual new discovery. By digging deeper into the histories of François Deloys and Georges Montandon, we can hope to find some additional clues into their motivations. Montandon appears to have been an ordinary anthropologist, and Deloys an ordinary geologist. For both men, the Loys Ape episode is the only extraordinary event in their histories. But when it happened, both seemed to go to extraordinary and even unscientific lengths to prove the creature was a new discovery. In fact, in Deloys' newspaper report, he even stepped far enough outside his geology background to assert this.
Until my discovery of the American anthropoid, we could only imagine that man migrated to these shores. But now, in the light of this discovery, it is obvious that the failure of the otherwise well-established principle of evolution, when it was applied to America, was due only to imperfect knowledge. The gap observed in America between monkey and man has been eliminated. The discovery of the Ameranthropoid has filled it.
Together with Montandon's aggressive promotion of the discovery in the scientific community, it does appear that both men went out of their way to prove something which wasn't well supported. We also want to look at the actual primate population in South America to see if something like Loys Ape might exist. So far, there are no other reports of anything like it. Some cryptozoologists have looked for local legends that might serve as a candidate match for Loys Ape. One has been consistently mentioned, the Didi. Most Didi stories are reminiscent of Bigfoot, a large, hairy man-beast, often fierce or aggressive. There are virtually zero bibliographic references to the Didi in the English language outside of the cryptozoology literature. It's certainly not a creature for which any empirical evidence exists, and thus it would be premature to characterize it as a possible explanation for Loys Ape. In order to suggest that creature X matches creature Y, we have to know the characteristics of each. Didi stories differ widely from one another, so it's not logical to say that it has any established characteristics. Another way we can evaluate Deloys' story is to look at all its details and compare them with known history. Does his story pass fact-checking? Does it fit well into the context of what was happening in Venezuela around 1920? Well, the story does come under suspicion. Notably, in his newspaper article, he claimed that no fewer than 17 of his men had been killed by the arrows of native tribesmen, and that he himself had been shot in the thigh and was still lame from this wound at the time. The place where he says he was attacked by the creatures is only about 15 kilometers west of La Fria, a city founded in 1853, capital of the municipality in which oil was discovered. La Fria and other towns in the area are where the oil companies based their expeditions. In short, Deloys' location simply wasn't as remote as most modern retellers indicate. It's often said that he spent 4 years in the jungle as if it was a single long expedition. But it wasn't. He spent 4 years making much shorter prospecting trips into the jungle. How likely is it that a geology party would allow 17 men to die without simply making the short return trip to La Fria or some other town? How likely is it that Deloys would have continued prospecting if any men had actually been violently killed on the job? The job simply wasn't worth men's lives, and at no time was Deloys in so remote a position that he could not easily have returned to civilization. In short, his story as printed is almost certainly a gross exaggeration in the style of the popular adventure fiction of the day. There are also conflicting accounts of the famous photograph's history. In 1962, a Dr. Enrique Tejera read an account of Loys Ape in a magazine called The Universal, and wrote to its author. The letter was published. Tejera said that he'd been in Venezuela with Dulois, working for the oil companies as a doctor, and the monkey photograph had a very different history. According to him, Dulois had been something of a practical joker, and had been given a local spider monkey called a marimonda, a white-fronted spider monkey, whose tail had become infected and been cut off. While they were in the city of Mene Grande in 1919, the monkey died, and that's when Dulois propped it up on the crate and took the photograph. Of course, we don't have any way to know which of these two stories is true, or even whether both are false, but the Tejera version is certainly more consistent with the photo. The monkey is sitting on a crate, which would have had to be very large if the monkey was as tall as Dulois said, and it's sitting in a clearing on a riverbank among the stumps of plants that have obviously been cut away. Yet, in Dulois' story, he and his men had only stopped there briefly to rinse off from, quote, the day's struggle across the jungle, hardly consistent with well-prepared clearings and large, heavy crates. In conclusion, I'm satisfied that there's enough wrong with Dulois' story to assert that it was, at least in large part, fabricated. But I wouldn't say that this can be proved. Regarding Montandon's involvement, my own assessment is that he may or may not have been deliberately deceptive. The story he promoted was in line with his normal research, and he worked in a science that was in its adolescence, if not its infancy. But he was willing to put his professional reputation on the line. I would probably camp in the jungles of Venezuela and not be worried about marauding ape men. But I might just tip my turn-of-the-century flask in applause of François Dulois and his pet spider monkey with the infected tail. You're listening to Skeptoid, a listener-supported program. I'm Brian Dunning from Skeptoid.com.